When people talk about land reform in South Africa, the conversation usually turns emotional very quickly. Land carries history, identity, wealth, and power. But when we step back and look at the issue through the lens of governance systems, a different picture starts to appear. South Africa's constitution was written in the mid 1990s at a moment where the country was moving from apartheid to a democratic order. The people who built those systems were not only the politicians, they included constitutional lawyers, international advisors, liberation leaders, and economic institutions that wanted South Africa to become part of the global economy again. Their goal was to create a political and institutional system that could stabilize the country after decades of conflict. The Constitution therefore became a kind of operating system for the state. It sets rules about property rights, government power, and how institutions interact. One of the key sections is Section 25, often called the Property Clause. It allows land to be expropriated in the public interest, including land reform, but it also requires a lawful process and fair compensation. The system was designed this way because its architects believed stability was necessary for security and economic recovery. So when the question comes up today, should South Africa amend the constitution to accelerate land reform? It is really a question about whether the original governance system has failed or whether the real problem lies somewhere else in how institutions behave and implement policy. So, to understand this properly, it helps to look at how institutional behavior actually works. Constitution does not redistribute land by itself. It only creates the rules under which governments operate. The institutions that carry out land reform are departments of agriculture, land commissions, the courts, the municipalities, and treasury systems that control the funding. These institutions are the machinery that maintains the governance system day to day. If those institutions move slowly or they lack capacity or mismanage programs, the results will be slow no matter what the Constitution says. This is where the debate about constitutional amendments sometimes misses the deeper issue. For the past 2 decades, South Africa has passed several laws aimed at land reform, restitution, and redistribution. Yet the pace of delivery has often been criticized as slow. Reports from oversight bodies and parliamentary committees repeatedly show that administrative problems and budget limits and planning, or rather planning failures, are major obstacles. So, in other words, the system already allows land reform, but the institutions responsible for executing it struggle to deliver consistently. From a systems perspective, rewriting the Constitution may not fix institutional performance. It simply changes the legal framework while leaving the same administrative machinery in place. Governance systems succeed when the institutions inside of them function effectively. When they do not, changing the constitutional rules does not necessarily produce better outcomes on the ground. There is also a security and economic dimension to this question that often gets overlooked. Property rights are one of the foundations of modern economic systems. Investors, farmers, banks, and infrastructure developers all rely on predictable rules about land ownership. If those rules appear unstable, economic activity can slow down because businesses hesitate to invest long term. It's not only a South African issue. Around the world, countries that weaken property systems often see economic turbulence. Zimbabwe's fast track land reform program in the early 2000s is one of the most widely discussed examples. The intention was to correct historical land inequality quickly, but the sudden collapse of legal certainty around land ownership caused agricultural production to fall sharply and created a broader economic crisis. That experience still shapes how global investors view land reform policies across the region. South Africa's constitution was designed partly to prevent that type of instability by requiring legal procedures and compensation standards. In 2025 and 2026, the government has already moved forward with the Expropriation Act, which creates clearer rules for how land can be taken for public interest under existing constitutional protections. This suggests that governance system is already evolving through legislation rather than constitutional rewriting. The next layer of this discussion is sovereignty, which simply means a country's ability to control its own decisions and resources. Land is one of the clearest expressions of sovereignty because it is the physical foundation of a nation's economy and agriculture, housing, and infrastructure. When people call for stronger land reform, they are often expressing a desire for greater national control over how land is owned and used. That concern is understandable, especially in a country where historic land ownership patterns were shaped by colonial and apartheid policies. However, sovereignty does not operate in isolation from the wider global system. South Africa today is deeply integrated into global financial networks and trade systems and investment markets. Banks finance farms and housing developments, and pension funds hold property assets, and international investors participate in infrastructure projects and commercial real estate. And these systems rely heavily on predictable legal frameworks. When property rights appear uncertain, capital tends to move elsewhere because financial systems are designed to avoid risk. This is one of the reasons the constitutional framework around land was built the way it was in the 1990s. The architects of the system understood that South Africa needed both justice and economic stability at the same time. They wanted to ensure that land reform could take place without destabilizing the broader economic structure that millions of livelihoods depend on. In this sense, sovereignty involves balancing two responsibilities. On one side is the need to correct historical injustice and expand access to land. On the other side is the need to maintain the institutional credibility that allows the economy to function within global systems of finance and trade and investment. Global governance pressures also shape how this issue unfolds, even if they are not always visible in everyday political debate. Because around the world, property systems, financial regulations, and investment standards are deeply connected through international institutions and market networks. Organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and global credit rating agencies monitor how countries manage economic stability and legal certainty. These institutions do not directly control national decisions, but their assessments influence how global capital flows. If investors believe a country's governance framework is becoming unpredictable, borrowing costs can rise and investments may slow. At the same time, African governments are becoming increasingly aware that they also hold leverage within these global systems. The continent has vast mineral resources, agricultural potential, and a growing population that represents future markets and labor forces. Because of this, African states are beginning to push more confidently for policy autonomy and economic transformation. South Africa sits right at the center of that conversation. It is both a major African economy and a country with one of the most sophisticated constitutional systems in the developing world. The Expropriation Act, introduced in recent years, shows how governments can adjust policy tools while keeping the constitutional framework intact. Rather than rewriting the entire system, legislation can refine how land reform is carried out within existing legal boundaries. This approach reflects an attempt to balance domestic political pressure for reform with the practical realities of operating inside a global economic network, right? So when we step back and look at the system as a whole, the key question becomes clearer. Governance is not just about political slogans or policy announcements. It's about how institutions distribute power and resources over time. The South African constitutional system was designed to create a stable platform where courts, legislators, and executive institutions operate within defined limits. The people who built the system believed that stability would protect security, it would encourage economic growth, and anchor South Africa within global governance structures. Today, the debate about amending the constitution for land reform raises a deeper institutional question. If the constitution were rewritten to allow faster or more aggressive expropriation, who would gain more power inside the system? In practice, it would likely concentrate more authority in the hands of the executive branch and the institutions responsible for land administration. That could speed up certain decisions, but it could also weaken the checks and balances that currently exist between courts and parliament and government departments. On the other hand, maintaining the existing constitutional framework keeps those institutional guardrails in place while allowing reform through legislation and administrative improvement. That approach it may appear slower, but it preserves the balance between justice, economic stability, and legal accountability. Governance systems evolve gradually, and each adjustment shifts power somewhere within the structure. The real question is not simply how quickly land reform happens, but how the system redistributes authority as it changes.